Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is Pei Vav, 86 of Bav Basra. We remain in the fifth perek, and we have finished to some degree our transition from the topic of what's included in a generic sale of an item to how do we make acquisitions? How do we make acquisitions? And let me share my screen and we can really get started. And so yesterday we concluded that by asking the following question: does the owner of a vessel, in particular, we'll call him the buyer, does that vessel allow the buyer to acquire something in the property of the seller? Now, we are not talking, and that will become clearer as we go through, we are not talking about where the seller says, go and make an acquisition with your vessel. If the seller actually says that, everybody agrees that the buyer's vessel will work. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where the buyer comes to the seller and the seller just measures the stuff that he's giving to the buyer in the seller's vessel. He doesn't say anything, or he just pours it in. At what point can we say that they can't go back on the transaction? Is it after each little bit, meaning once you pour it in that little bit, then that's it? Or is there some other rule? So we're going to see something more about this shortly. But for right now, we're answering the question in a generic way. Now, we tried to answer the question twice yesterday. First, Rav Huna attempted to bring a proof that the acquisition does work from a Mishnah in Gittin, but Rav Nachman pointed out that proof was not a valid proof. There were lots of problems with that proof because the Mishnah in Gittin was so qualified by the Amoraim that commented on it that it was not actually about the same topic. There was too much permission that was already granted to the woman to have her vessel where she was. And so as a result, that's not the case. That's not the case that we're trying to ask about. So then Rav Nachman attempted to prove that the acquisition does not work from a brisa that we had quoted earlier. And again, we concluded that the proof was also not definitive. Today, again, we pick up at the end of the fourth line from the bottom of 85b from Pei Hey Amud Bet, and try again to answer the question. So let's take a look. Amarava, Rava says, Tashma, come and hear, Mashach chamarav ufo alav. If you pull the, now chamarav can mean his donkey, but it can also mean, or his donkeys, but it can also mean his donkey drivers, meaning the people who are moving, getting the donkeys to move. So we're going to assume that it's referring to the donkey drivers based on a Rashbam that we will see in a moment. Or you get him, or you pull on the laborers. And what do we mean by that? Let's take a look at Rashbam. Well, first of all, that Rashbam says second to last of the medium wide lines in the Rashbam. Second word on the line highlights an explanation of what this is talking about. V'hatuvua al gaban. The wheat that you're trying to buy is being held by the donkey drivers or the workers. Okay, so that's point number one. And you bring these carriers into the house, Bain Pasak Ad Shalom Madad, whether you set the price and didn't measure, Bain Madad Ad Shalom Pasak, whether you measured and you didn't set the price, Shneyan Yecholim Lachzer Behen. Both of them are able to go back on it. So let's take a look at Rashbam. Rashbam really helps us understand what the facts are in these situations. Bain Pasak Ad Shalom Madad, if you set the price but you didn't measure. Well, Imbo Lachzor, if now the seller wants to retract and decide not to do the deal, Kodem Medida before the measuring, right? So we set up a price. I say that I'm going to sell you, 100 pounds of wheat for $1 a pound. I have no idea if that's a good price or not, but we'll just go with that. Okay. But, I have, we set the price. So that's good.
And we're at your house.
And we're at my house. But I have not put it into your measuring vessels. So yachzaru. So then they can go back to b'may nikna, because how even in your mind do you think that you made a kinyan here? There was no kinyan, right? You never acquired it. Lo mashichat. You didn't drag it to the wheat. So right, lo mashichas tvua yesh. There is no dragging of the There's no transfer. The low rishus lokeach, and we're not in your property. We're in my property. Exactly. So yesh de odam al tzavaram, and it's still on the shoulders of the carriers. Below hunachu l'rishuto. They didn't put it into. Actually, we can be talking about. Even if it's in your property, I'm sorry, we're in your property, you're in the buyer's property. And so they didn't put it down into your possession. So they're still holding it, and they're my workers, and they're
There's no kinyan.
so there's no kinyan. Sharei lo pirkan. They didn't unload. Because the second case, as we're going to, when we turn the daf to pay Bava and Aleph, we're going to see that we're talking about a case where they do unload. Dikatani ba pirkan, because that's later case we specifically talk about when they unload. Miklal de resha below pirkan, which implies at the beginning of this brisa that's being quoted is talking about where you did not unload. Ella hachnasa ba'alma. All you have is the walking in. Shemashkan, that he dragged them in, he pulled them in, and brought them into his house. Katani. That's what we're talking about. V'hach mashicha. Now this bringing them into his house, lav mashichahi. That is not the kind of mashicha. That is not kind of the pulling, the dragging that we're talking about. That constitutes a change of ownership. Liknos, that in order to make an acquisition, shaharei ha'adam hu moshech, because he is pulling a person. U'mashichas adam ta'un peiros lo mihanya. And if you pull somebody who's holding peiros, that doesn't help. That doesn't do it. Liknos as a peiros, to buy the peiros. Ad sheyimshach a peiros, that's mine, until you pull on the fruit themselves. So as a result, no working. And now, not only so that's when you set the price, but you never actually did any measurement. But what if you did the measurement? And again, we're measuring in your house, in your vessels. So the Bain Madad, the Hunchol Rishuso, where actually it is now fully in your possession, but we didn't set a price. Ad Shalo Pasak. Imbo Laxar. Now, again, continuing in the Rashbam, we're in the middle of the third to last line, that if in fact you come on in, have a seat, if you in fact want to retract Kodem Pisuk before we set the price, Kozrin, you can. We're doing the Rashbam right now. That in fact, even though it is already, the wheat is already in Stan's possession, because we never set a price, we both have the ability to retract the deal. Even though it's in your vessels. Lo kanya rishuso kodem pisuk. His property, Stan's property, can't make an acquisition before we set the price. Even if he did the actual dragging, kodem pisuk, before we set the price, lo mahanya, that doesn't help. As we are going to explain, de lo samcha daite, because neither of us know for sure that the deal is going to happen, and so as a result, we don't have any reliance on the deal. Lo de mocher, below de lokeach, neither the seller nor the buyer. Shamocher shema yifsok nemehem yikarim, right? Yoter. Because maybe the seller will set too high a price. Oh, alokeach yishalem bizol yoter, or the buyer will set too low a price. Umasnisin de katani mashach below madad. Now, when our Mishnah talked about measuring without, we talked about doing mashicha without measuring, kana that you make that's considered a kinyan, kishipasa koda mashicha. We're definitely talking about where the price was set, meaning you need the terms of the deal. And indeed, in U.S. law, that's the case today, right? You need the terms of the deal. Okay, so that is situation number one.
Whose donkeys are these? He's pulling this, the buyer is pulling his own donkeys?
No, the seller. It's got to be the seller's donkeys. And again, we're assuming that it's the seller based on that Rashban that we just read. I mean, you can read it as the donkeys, but I'm going to read it as the donkey drivers because Rashban certainly understands that we're talking about pulling people. It's not clear.
Right.
There may be the pulling of the donkey. It depends. Again, likely not, but likely it still won't make a difference. But the pulling of a person is clearly not going to be sufficient.
But isn't that a little odd? Why is he pulling another person?
Because
He's got a rope around the person and he's pulling that person?
The person, the buyer understands that the law is that Mashicha is how you do a kinyan. So he thinks to himself, okay, I'm going to do Mashicha on the people. I'm going to bring them into the property, pull them into my property, and now I'll own the stuff on their back. That's what he thinks. And the halacha is that no, you did Mashicha on the person is still employed or owned by the seller, and therefore it doesn't actually cause a transaction.
No, again, I understand that. So he says it's the difference between people and the chomer itself. But yeah. But isn't this, at what point does this not become assault and battery? You walk into someone's house and start dragging a person.
So it's important to understand that although Mashicha literally means pull or to drag, the point is that if you lead a person or lead an animal, that is considered essentially Mashicha. So if you get the animal to move, as we've seen or earlier, I think even in this Masechet, that is sufficient. So the point is that you don't actually have to do a physical battery on the person in order to perform the Mashicha on them. All you have to do is say, come on in, and then they come in and you've done the Mashicha essentially. So, and of course you have that intention, but the intention is not sufficient in this case, especially because there
I was thinking of this in a more dramatic sense.
Yes, that's why I'm telling you.
Like a lasso, the Wild West.
No.
A lasso around the person and pulls the person.
We don't need to go that far, thankfully. Okay, so that is the part one of the brisa. Part two of the brisa, pirkan, if they unloaded the produce. Now again, all of this is still trying to answer the question of whether the vessel of a buyer allows the buyer to acquire something in the property of the seller. So we haven't yet gotten to the relevant piece of this in order to try and make a proof, but here we're about to. Pirkan, if the buyer unloaded the produce and thereby presumably the produce is presumably in a basket. Right. The basket presumably belongs to the seller.
On the donkeys.
The baskets that were on the donkey or on the donkey carriers. And now on the donkey drivers. And now that basket is in the possession of Stan's property, is on Stan's property. They've been brought into Stan's house. Pasak ajlo madad. If they've set the price and they haven't, even if they haven't measured, ein shneyan yicholon lachzor behen. There's no retracting. So even though there's no measurement yet, it's still a deal because you are agreeing to buy this basket full of wheat. Madad ad shelo pasak. However, if they measured without setting the price, again, it's not enough. Shneyan yicholon lachzor behen because they didn't have a set of price. Now, umedikelyo democher birshus lokeach lo kana. Now, this is a little bit strange wording, but let's go parse it slowly. So the vessel that was taken off the donkey driver or my worker and put into your possession was my vessel, right? It was my vessel that is holding all the wheat. Now, my vessel holding all the wheat does not stop you from acquiring the wheat according to this brisa, right? Because the basket has now been put into your property, and we say that we've set a price, so you've acquired it. So I don't understand. So now that we've said that, my vessel in your property doesn't allow me to make an acquisition. So kelio dilokeach nami bershos mocher lokana. So similarly, when Stan's vessel is in my property, and I put the wheat, pour the wheat into Stan's vessel, also that should not necessarily make an acquisition. So isn't that a reasonable proof? The Gemara asks. So Amar of Nachman Bar Yitzchak, no, shvachan. We're talking about where you poured the wheat out. Well, presumably it wasn't wheat, because if it was wheat, you probably leave it in the basket. So you poured out the item into your property directly. So it's no longer being held by my vessel. Well, Ikbad Rava got upset about this. Midi shvachan katani? Are you going to tell me that this brisa said the word spilled? Pirkan katani. It said the word unloaded. There's a big difference. Unloaded implies that you take the bags out in the bags. You don't spill out the bags. So Ella Amar Bar Rav Ashi. So Mar Bar Rav Ashi further qualifies b'metachle detume. We're talking about bundles of garlic, which are not transported in sacks, and one can understand why, because if you maybe you don't want to be so pungent, but overwhelming, exactly. But in any event, the point is, and maybe it's just the way garlic is, I don't know. But the bottom line is that that's not sold in bags. It's sold in bundles, and those bundles are directly in Stan's property. And so as a result,
frozen.
What? It also comes frozen? Yeah, good to know. So, as we see, first of the widest lines in the Rashbam at the bottom of the page, that these are bundles of garlic that are not in bags. And so as a result, they are directly in Stan's property. So as a result, we cannot bring a proof from this brisa to the question of whether or not a buyer's vessel works in the home of the seller. So
how does he carry the garlic though? Does he carry them all in his hand?
It's bundled, it's wrapped up. There's a big, there's a string around it. But that string around it that keeps it all in a bundle doesn't result in it being in the seller's vessel. It's not in my vessel any longer. As soon as it gets moved onto Stan's property, it's in Stan's property. There is no vessel of mine that it would stop it from being acquired by
I think of garlic in cloves, in a clove. You buy a small clove of garlic with about eight cloves in there. So how are they gonna tie all those together?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe I don't know how garlic grows before the cloves, meaning maybe the cloves are attached to some, some aspect of either some growth that comes from the cloves. I don't know if the cloves are actually the root or are they the flower. I'm not 100% sure. I did not do the research on the botany aspects of garlic, but the point is that presumably they are attached to something that is growing. It's a vegetable, and so it's attached to something that you can then wrap a string around in order to bundle a bunch of cloves together. That's presumably what we're dealing with. So it's not like the bags that you see in the shopping stores, because you wouldn't. Correct. It's a little ball. So you wouldn't be able to, use a string to wrap those together. But clearly, we're talking about something that you can use, that you can bundle in this context. So it could be that we would have to say that this is referring to some other produce, if in fact garlic doesn't actually grow that way. But in any event, the bottom line is that that's the situation that we're having, that in fact, we're dealing with bundles. So Amrle Huna Breidermar Zutra Ravina. So 1 second, Michde Pirkan Katani, you said that you unloaded Mali Pasak, Mali Lo Pasak. If in fact that bundle was unloaded into Stan's property, why do we care whether or not we set the price? Shouldn't we say that Stan made the acquisition? After all, he did an act of acquisition. Why are we saying that that's not enough? So Amrle, Ravina explained, Pasak Samcha Daita, when you set the price, so everybody has a meeting of the minds. But Lo Pasak, Lo Samcha Daita. Well, but when you haven't set the price, you have not had any kind of meeting of the minds. So that is the Gemara's explanation as to why we absolutely always need to have a fixed price, a set price. So in order to have a valid transaction. So Amrle Ravina Ravashi. So Tashma, one more try at proving whether or not the buyer's vessel will work in the seller's home. So Rav Ushmuel, to Amri Tarbayu, what do Rav and Shmuel both say? Kelyo shel Adam Kona Lo B'chol Makom, that a person's vessels can acquire for him anywhere. La Suye Mai, what does that come to include when you say anywhere? Lav La Suye Rishos Moker, doesn't it come to include the property of the seller? So yes, it does, but Hasam de Amrle Zil Kni. This is what Rashbam has been citing regularly throughout our discussion, is this language of, yes, it does work, but it's talking about where the seller said, go make an acquisition, where effectively affirmative permission was granted. And our question about whether or not a buyer's vessel works in the home of the seller is when the buyer does not have any special permission to make the acquisition. And so that's the story there. And so as a result, in the end, we have not been successful at all in proving one way or the other. But the good news is that the Shulchan Aruch does reach a conclusion for us. And the Shulchan Aruch rules that a buyer's vessel does not work in the seller's property if the seller does not explicitly give permission for the vessel to make the acquisition. And that makes total sense, yes. Because again, the basis of Rav and Shmuel's statement is, does the person whose vessel it is, does the buyer's vessel have permission to be there? If it has permission to be there, then it can make an acquisition. If it doesn't have permission to be there, it cannot necessarily make an acquisition. Okay. All right. So that is that.
But the buyer has permission to be there, right? He's buying a good.
Yeah, the buyer has permission to be there, but his vessel doesn't have explicit permission to make an acquisition. And therefore, we effectively say that the vessel is going to be considered nullified relative to the overall property that you're in. And you're going to have to either lift that vessel or remove the vessel and drag the vessel into a different property, into a different rishus, in order for you to make the acquisition if the seller doesn't give explicit permission. Again, the seller says zil kni, so then you're golden. So you want to always make sure. Now, the question is sometimes there can be an implicit zil kni. Maybe if the question is and this is dealt with by the Rishonim, what if the seller is the one who pours the item into the buyer's vessel? Does that constitute effectively giving permission? Again, there are those who say yes. Okay, so now we're going to further discuss the kinyan of Mashicha. So we're going to quote a Mishnah from Kiddushin regarding Mashicha and tell a related rule. So let's go and let's see what we got. So Tanan Hassam, we learned in a Mishnah, again, this is a Mishnah in Kiddushin, Daf Kaf Vav Amud Aleph, Nechasim sheyesh lahen achrayas. If you have property, Mark, they can use your help. So if you have property that can have a lien on it, niknin bekesef, you can make an acquisition with money, ubishtar, or with a contract, b'chazaka, or with an act of ownership, with an act of a chazaka. And so that's with respect to real property. And this is why we're citing it here. When it comes to property that does not have a lien, meaning if you sell, when it comes to real property, if I lend you money and then you sell some property to somebody else, I have a lien on that property and can collect from that property because you sold it after you borrowed the money from me, and assuming that, and you haven't paid me back, and we're assuming that you borrowed the money using a contract, so people understand that there's a contract out there, and so as a result, the buyer of the property knows that it's subject to my potential coming to collect it. But when it comes to things that don't have a lien, meaning if I lend you money and you sell your Gemara, then I cannot go to the buyer of your Gemara and take that back because there is no lien on that property. So, and the difference is it movable property? Because movable property can be hidden, etc. So as a result, we assume that the lender, I don't rely on the ability to collect from that. But the real property, we assume that I do. So when it comes to things that are movable property, the only way you can acquire them is with Mashicha. Now, Besura masnu lala hashmaita b'shmei the Rav Chisda. In Surah, they taught the following teaching in the name of Rav Chisda. B'Pumpadisa masnu la mishmei the Rav Kahana. And in Pumpadisa, they taught it in the name of Rav Kahana. Amri la, and some people say it was taught mishmei the Rava in the name of Rava. V'lo shanu ela dvarim she'ein darkan la'akbiyah. When we say that that movable property can only be acquired through Mashicha, that's talking about things that are too large to be lifted, that are not normally lifted. But when it comes to things that are normally lifted, you can lift them and acquire them, but Mashicha does not work for those items. So Yosef Abaye, Abaye was sitting, the Ka'amr Lahashmaita, and was teaching over this teaching. The Esve Rav Ada bar Masna la Abaye, and Rav Ada bar Masna asked the following question, because listen to the following brisa: Hagonev kis b'Shabbos. If you steal a money purse, on Shabbos, chayiv, you're liable. And Rashba makes clear that you're chayiv 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines down. I probably should have made this explicit. B'tashlumin, to pay back the money that was stolen, right? Because and why? Well, we think that that maybe you're not chayiv because deleka lamemer kimle b'derabamine. We're not going to say that only the larger punishment should apply. Deleka hachi shtei rishayos biyachad, because there were no two wicked actions taken at one time. Because what did you do first? The first thing you did was you lifted the money bag. As soon as you lifted it in my property, you stole it. Now it's stolen. Now, then what did you do? You walked outside with it. Well, only when you walked outside with it did you violate the prohibition of carrying on Shabbos, which makes you subject to the death penalty. So only later are you subject to the death penalty. So as a result, you're going to be both liable for the theft and liable for the death penalty. On the other hand, because you are already liable for the theft. Before you violated Shabbos. But but if you were dragging it as you were going out and dragging and going out, but you never actually lifted the item, well then putter, then you're exempt. Because what's the moment that you violated Shabbos? The moment you violated Shabbos is when you left my property and you went into the public thoroughfare. You went into somebody else's property. Now you did Mashicha and you own it. And when is it that you violated Shabbos? at that exact same moment. And so as a result, now we will say kum le b'marabamine. So as a result, we're going to say putter. Shahare Isser Shabbos Uganeba Bayin Keachad. The prohibitions came at the same time, both Shabbos prohibition and the violation of theft. Well, 1 second. So now that we brought this brisa, the question is, 1 second, doesn't this brisa show that we're talking about a money purse, and yet we're saying that the money purse was being dragged out? So isn't a money purse something that you can lift? And yet dragging seemed to work as a method of making an acquisition. And nonetheless, we say that you acquired it with Mashicha. So again, take a look at the Rashbam Putter. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines down from in the widest lines at the bottom of Pei Vav and Bet. Pei Vav and Aleph, excuse me, in the Rashbam. Putter, middle of the line, Minat Tashlumim, you're not exempt from paying back. Because we have the principle of you're only liable for the most severe. And the Torah says, it was actually in this past week's Torah portion, so we can say that this is a little bit of a Daf Yomi coincidence, that it's because of his wickedness. Well, 1 second, Mishum Risha Achat. You can only make somebody liable for a single wickedness. You're not going to make him liable for 2 wickednesses that happen at the same time. And so as a result, that's again, the question at the end of the day is, how could you have this liability for stealing? You didn't actually make an acquisition if it's something that you can lift and you only did Mashicha. Or doesn't it show that Mashicha works even if you're able to lift an item? So Amar Le, Abaye explained, B'misna. We're talking about a purse that has a strap. Well, Ananami B'misna coming. I'm fine with talking about a strap. A strap doesn't weigh anything either. So presumably you could lift the strap with the purse. No, Amrle, Rabbi explains, no, the midi de boy misna. I'm saying that it needs a strap, meaning that the only way that this is not a simple, a change purse that you and I would think about when we think about a change purse, but rather it's, imagine a humongous bag of coins, right? That is too heavy to lift. And then you attach to it a strap in order to be able to pull that bag of coins. That's what we're talking about. And so as a result, you can't lift it. And so that's why you have to drag it. Okay, so we've tried effort number 1 to say that that maybe Mashicha should work even if you can't lift it. So let's see about our second effort at that try. We're going to end up trying 4 times to show that maybe we should be able to do Mashicha even if you can pick something up. And all 4 times are going to be rejected. So second of our 4 efforts. Okay, and let me just actually write this down. Okay, so next, so Tashma b'rishus mocher. We have the brisa that we cited, that we learned yesterday, that if you're in the property of the seller, lo kana, the buyer does not acquire ad she'agbiena o ad she'yotziena mershuso, until you lift it or you take it out of the domain. Well, what does that imply? Alma midi debar hagba. Ibai hagba kanile, v'ibai mashicha kanile. Well, 1 second. If I'm saying that the thing that I'm acquiring in the property of the seller, again, now we'll switch it around and you'll be the seller, Stan, and I'll be the buyer, that the only way I'm going to acquire the wheat is by lifting it up or by pulling it out, doesn't that imply that it doesn't make a difference how heavy it is? I have both options available to me. So doesn't that show that Mashicha will work even when I can lift it? So Amarav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, let's stud in Katani. No, it's two sides of the coin. That on one side, Midi Devar Hagba Bagba. When it comes to something that you can lift, you have to lift it. Davar b'mashicha. But something that you need to drag, you would acquire through dragging. Now let's take a look at the Rashbam, because this results in an interesting machlokus, because what have we learned? Right now, we're focusing on things that are not normally picked up. And we say that those can be acquired with Mashicha.
Right.
And things that are normally picked up can be acquired. I'm sorry, what I meant to say is the following. That what have we been focusing on right now? That things that that are normally picked up can be acquired only with Hagbah and not Mashicha. But what about the opposite? What about something that's normally dragged? What if you were to pick that up? Okay, so again, something that's normally dragged, and now you're picking it up. Does that Hagbah work or not? So we're going to have a machlokas Rishonim on that topic, and it's based on this Rashbam. So let's Dudin Katani. 1, 2, 3, 6 lines up, about 1/3 into the line. Ad Shiag Biena.
Is that normally, there's something that's normally dragged because it cannot be lifted up, but then
it's
you
hard
use extra,
to lift. It can't be, of course, it can't be that it's impossible to lift, because if it was impossible to lift, then how's the guy lifting it?
So the question is, can he then use, if he were to use extraordinary means like a crane to pick it up? I mean, he can't.
Well,
I
would use say a lever or maybe a pulley system, because the point is that a crane, question is whether do you need your direct force, your actual force, or can a machine do it? That's a different question, and I don't want to address that question. But yes, that's exactly right. If you're now using extra force in order to be able to lift it. So let's study. So ad sheyig biena im davar kalhu, you need to do until you pick it up. When it comes to a light item, you have not made an acquisition. Oh, ad sheyotziena, or until you take it out, im davar kavedhu, if it's something very heavy. And according to, in my humble opinion, nearly, it seems to me, to have imatzu l'terutze, we could have answered this question, but that by saying hacha b'midi devar mashicha askinen. We're talking about something that is fit to do mashicha, that you could do mashicha because it's very heavy. Hilkach, in that situation, because it's heavy, iboy b'hagba, you could do either lifting likne in order to make a kinyan of the hagba adifa mashicha, because lifting is stronger than dragging. The kona, and you would still be kona. The kol davar, in any kind of item. The e-boy b'mashicha likne, and if you wanted, you could also do dragging. Daho orche de b'mashicha, because the normal way of making the acquisition is mashicha. Ela denicha tvei l'oroye din tarbayu. But the Gemara preferred to teach both rules. Demidi debar hagba b'hagba below b'mashicha, and that specifically we would learn that something that is supposed to be lifted can be lifted, but you can't do mashicha. But umidi debar mashicha afilu b'mashicha. But when it comes to something that is fit for dragging, then even dragging works. Certainly lifting works, but even dragging works. So that's the position of the Rashbam. The Rashba also agrees with it, but the Ravid says no, lifting does not work that for things that are not normally picked up. The Ravid focuses on what's the normal method of making an acquisition. But the Rashbam and the Rashba arguably are focused on the fact that when you lift something, it's as if it's in your property because you've lifted it. So that could also be the basis of this machlokas. All right, so that's point. That's that point. And now we are ready to turn the page to Pei Vav Amud, and we're going to have effort number 3. Effort number 3 at questioning, shouldn't Mashicha work even if you can lift it? So Tashma, listen to what our Mishnah says. Hamochar peiros l'chaveiro. If you sell fruit to your friend, mashach v'lo madad. If you did Mashicha without measuring, Kani, you've made an acquisition. V'hapeiros dibnei hagbaninu. But fruit is something that you can lift. V'ketani dekani mibashicha. And yet we said that you acquire it with Mashicha. Doesn't that show that Mashicha works even for something that you can lift easily? No, here's what we're talking about. B'shalife ravrave. We're dealing with large bundles. So as a result, you cannot easily lift them. Well, in second, ihachi, if you're going to tell me that this Mishnah is talking about large bundles, what about the end of our Mishnah? Ema Seifa. The end of our Mishnah said, Halokeach pisha mechavero, if you buy flax from your friend, lo kana achi yitaltalenu mimakom zeh lemakom acher. You don't acquire it until you move it from one place to the other, namely hagba and not mashicha. Atu pishdan b'shalife ravere milo avdi. Well, one second, aren't you going to make the flax into large bundles as well? And so as a result, how can you say it? Meaning, if you're going to tell me that everything's about small bundles, so great, then we should say that our Mishnah proves that you can do Mashicha even for something you can lift. And if you're going to tell me that something that we're talking about large bundles, well, then how in the world are you going to lift the large bundle of flax? So the Gemara answers, no, shiny pishtan to mishtamate. No, flax is different because it's slippery. And so as a result, it's so smooth that if you have it in a big bundle and you try to move that bundle, it will fall apart. So as a result, you need to use small bundles that can be easily lifted. Okay, so that
now, metaltel doesn't necessarily mean hagba'ah. Yataltel means simply to move it. So moving it could be done through mashicha.
Yes, that is certainly true, and maybe the Gemara could have answered that. But Yiltatalena certainly has an aspect of carrying, right? We say,
we say no say. We say for carrying, we say no say.
Yeah, I hear that. And maybe the Gemara could have answered that, but that is not the way the Gemara goes. Clearly, the Gemara is understanding Shiyutal as being some kind of Hagbah. Otherwise, it could have just said that, then it would need to explain why it's using a different language and not using the word Mashicha. So that would, the Gemara would need to ask that. So here we've answered the question in a way that doesn't result in the follow-up question of, well, one second, why are we using a different language?
No, I understand, but sometimes the Gemara is very specific.
I totally agree with you that
Rava got angry when he said Shafchan, and the Mishnah says,
right? 100%. It's an interesting, I did not see any of the Rishonim who talk about it, but you make an interesting point. So, okay, so now effort number 4 to show that maybe Mashicha should be effective even when something can be lifted easily. So Amrle Ravina Ravashi Tashma. Again, now we're doing a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in Kedushin Daf Kaf Hey Amabet. But Behema Gasa, when it comes to a big animal, Nichnas B'Masira, then you acquire it through Masira. Namely, that means handing over the reins effectively. Of the hadaka bagba, but when it comes to a small animal, it's done through lifting. Divri Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. That's what Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says. But the Chachamim say behema daka mashicha. No, you don't do a behema daka with hagba. You do it with mashicha. So in second, v'ha behema daka davar hagbahi. We know that it's got to be something that can be lifted because Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar and Rabbi Meir say you need to lift the animal. Dekani b'mashicha, and yet we're saying that mashicha works. So shiny behema de sarcha. So an animal is different because of sarcha. Now what is sarcha? So take a look 6 lines down. Mistarekas umistabekes 6 lines down in the widest lines of the Rashbam. Mistarechas or mistabekes biragleha bekarka. That basically it's going to clutch and stick with its legs to the ground, meaning that an animal that small animals, even though they are capable of being lifted, they don't like to be lifted, and they will do what they can to try and attach themselves to the ground below Efsher Bagba. And so it's not so simple to do it with lifting. Ki'im Bekoshi, only with difficulty. Hilkach or Chaba Mashicha. And therefore, the Chachamim say that you need to do Mashicha. Whereas Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, they say, no, even though it may take some extra effort, we're going to say that you have to do Hagbah. Okay. So again, those were our 4 efforts. None of them were successful. And so now we are going to go to the next item, which is a teaching of Rav and Shmuel. We're going to have a question on this, and we're going to leave additional questions, God willing, for tomorrow. So Rav Shmuel da Amri Tarvayu Kor Bishloshim Ani Mocher Lecha. I'm selling you a kor for 30 salah. Now a kor has 30 saw in it. So what is the net price? It's 1 selah per saw. So maybe my dollar per pound is not so off. But in any event, Yachol Lachserbo, Afilu B'Sa'ach Rona. The parties can undo the deal, can retract and decide, you know what? Never mind. I don't want to do the deal. Until the seller measures out that final saw. Kor bishloshim saw. But if the guy says, I'm selling you 30 that for a kor I'm selling you 30 for 30 saw bisela I'm sorry, it should kor bishloshim saw bisela ani mocher lach, that I am selling you a kor for 30 sela, and what that means is 1 saw for every sela, because 30 saw make up a kor. So then, Rishon Kana, meaning that if when I'm selling to Stan my big bushel of wheat, I say to him that I'm selling him a 30-pound bushel for $30, and then until I weigh out the 30th pound, we can both go back and say, you know what, we don't want to do it, even though I'm using your vessels. But on the other hand, if I tell Stan, I'm selling you 30 pounds for 30 saw for $30, and I'm selling you each pound for $1. So then every time we hit a pound in the weight, that pound has been bought by Stan. And so as a result, we cannot go back on that.
Can we go forward?
Say more.
Can we go forward? We can't go back. But
No,
let's say I don't want to go forward.
Yes, you can say I don't want to go forward. Correct. You can say that you know what? In the end, I only want to buy 25.
And you can allow it.
And that's fine. Right. So Tashma, Imahaisa Mida. So now we're going to challenge that statement. So that was the statement of Rav and Shmuel, that basically if you give the small units in an overall transaction, yes, then it means that you're okay with a deal that is of smaller units. So Tashma, listen to the following. We saw this in a brisa that we saw a couple of days ago, that Imhaisa Mida Shel Echad Mehan, I think we saw it yesterday. If the measuring cup belongs to one of them, well then, and in particular now we'll focus on the buyer, Rishon Kana. The buyer acquires every little bit put into that cup. The avalgav delo nismala hamida. That implies even when the measuring cup is not yet full. So doesn't that show that it doesn't make a difference what our deal is? That as we pour into the cup, the sale is complete. So the Gemara answers no. Kagon de amrla. Hin b'shnayim asar slaim log b'sela ani mocher log. We're dealing with a situation where the person says, I'm selling you a hin for 12 sela, which is equal to a log for every sela, because a hin is 12 log. And so as a result, that's the situation that we're talking about. Keda'amar Rav Kahana, as Rav Kahana said in connection with the Beis Hamikdash, or a different matter altogether, Shnasos hayu behin, that there were markings in a hin measuring cup. And Hakanami Shnasos hayu b'midos. So here too, we're dealing with a situation where there are markings on the measuring cup. And so as a result, yes, it is true that Brisa indicated that the purchaser acquires each little bit, but we're dealing with each little bit that is up to the next measuring item in the measuring cup. And so as a result, that's where we're saying that Rishon Kana, that he acquires every little bit. And let's take a look. We can look at this inside. So Rashbam first, Rav Kahana, third to last line on the daf, where it says the Maseches Menachos. This is taught in Maseches Menachos, meaning it's taught in connection with offerings, because we say that Shnasos hayu behin, that there are measurings in the hin measuring cup, Shel Kodesh, in the Beis Hamikdash, in the holies, because Ad Kan Lapar, you had a separate marking on the measuring cup for an ox. Ad Kan La'ayo. Up to here, a different marking on the cup for a ram. Ad Kan Lekeves. And up to here for a sheep. Kilomar Simonim Lemidas. You have different signs. Lemidas Chatzi Ahin Lapar, because you need a half a hin of wine for an ox. Ashlishit Ha'in La'ayo, a third of a hin for a ram, or a vizahin lekeves, and a quarter of a hin for a sheep. And in all cases, we're talking about yayin, and that's indeed a pasuk that we have in Sefer Bamidbar when it discusses the korbanot, that you have these different amounts of wine that we need to include in the korbanot. And so as a result, just as there is a marking on the measuring cup in connection with the Beis Hamikdash, we too, in our case, are talking about where there are markings on the measuring cup. And so as a result, when we say that as the produce is being put into the buyer's measuring cup, that he's acquiring bit by bit as it goes in, it means as we get to each measuring line, he has acquired that amount for the agreed on price per unit. And so that is the
situation. Isn't that a proof? Isn't that a proof that he could stop one by one?
So this is not a proof, so that because we say that the case is where the seller has specifically detailed the minor price, that he's saying, I'm selling you a hin, which is for 12 sela, and with each log equal to a sela. So he specified the particular price of the portional of a small piece of the overall transaction. And so as a result, every time you fill in and you get up to a log worth of, for each measuring cup, that it's measures log 1, log 2, log 3, etc. So every time you reach a log, that's when we said that Rishon Kana in that brisa, that's what you're acquiring. And so as a result, this is not a counter proof to the statement of Rav and Shmuel. And in fact, Rav and Shmuel, at least at the moment, are correct that when you say a single unit for the entire amount, well, then you have to buy the entire amount until you do, the deal's not final. But when you add the details of the smaller pieces, the smaller units, well, then every time you reach a smaller unit, that is a completed sale. And so that is the point of view that we will once again challenge, God willing, tomorrow. And so again,
isn't that a proof isn't that a proof that in this case where he says, I'm selling you a sela I'm selling you a, what was it?
A saw per sela, yes.
A saw per sela. Even though I'm selling you 30 for 30, I'm selling you a saw. So once you buy one, we can stop the deal, right?
Correct.
Okay, that is a proof then.
No, it's but so you're asking why don't we say that actually the brisa that we cited earlier is an explicit proof to Rav and Shmuel? Well, it's not an explicit proof because the brisa does not explicitly say that what the seller said. So we don't know what the seller said. And so what the Gemara's answer to the challenge is maybe we're dealing with a situation where the seller said the portion, the subunits. And so as a result, that's why it's not a counter proof to Rav and Shmuel. But it's also not a proof to Rav and Shmuel because it didn't explicitly tell us that we were including the partial units. So maybe it's talking about a situation where there were no partial units mentioned. So you don't have a definitive proof one way or the other from the brisa, but and so that's why it's phrased as a challenge and a response as opposed to an effort to prove. We could have done it the exact opposite, but it's not explicit. There was no explicit reference to selling for the partial amounts. And so as a result, the presumption is that you didn't mention the partial amounts. And so that's why we use it as a challenge, and it really isn't a proof either. So,
but I thought that it's the Bryce, and it says, first of all, it says Kor b'shloshim ani mocher lach, and then it says
no, that's not the brisa.
No,
that's
well, that's Rav and Shmuel's
That's
opinion.
Rav and Shmuel.
Okay, then it says Kor b'shloshim sa b'sela ani mocher lach.
Yes, that's also not the brisa. That's Rav and Shmuel speaking. The brisa is just im haisa mida shel echad mehen. If the measuring cup belonged to one of them, rishon kana, the owner acquires each little bit. There's no detail in that brisa as to what the seller said. And so we challenge because our initial thought is even though the measurement cup's not full, and presumably there was no specification by the seller of the smaller amounts. And then our response is, no, maybe there was a reference to smaller amounts. So because that brisa doesn't actually mention anything about what was said by the seller, we can't necessarily use it as a proof for Rav and Shmuel. We're only able to potentially use it as a challenge, and our response is no, that's talking about where the seller gave the smaller markings as well, so gave the smaller measurements as well.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but I'm thinking we could potentially use it as a proof, right? Because
again, if in fact it was explicit about the fact that a partial measurement would result in rishon kana, you're absolutely right. But that brisa doesn't tell us what the seller said. So if just to give a counterfactual, if the Gemara were to say, let's give a proof from that brisa, well, then the response to that proof would be, I don't know how you know that the seller said the partial amounts. Maybe the seller only said a core for 30 sellas and didn't mention a saw for sella, and this is actually a counter proof. And that would be the way the Gemara would result, and so it would not be a proof either. The bottom line is that we don't know one way or the other. We don't have a proof one way or the other from that brisa.
So that would be a counter
try
proof.
And challenge Rav and Shmuel again, God willing, tomorrow.
Oh, I see. So if you said another way, then this would come as a counter proof. Let me say that again.
So if in fact you were to say, oh, that brisa approves Rav and Shmuel, right, I would respond to you by saying, how do you know? Maybe that brisa is talking about where a person said, I'm selling you a core for 30 sellas. And didn't say anything about a saw for each sella. And nonetheless, that brisa says that each little bit gets acquired. So that would be a counterproof to Rav and Shmuel.
Right.
And then you would say back to me, but no, it doesn't have to be a counterproof because maybe it was, I'm selling you a core for 30 sellas and a saw for each sella. And so because we can't go either way, in the end, it's not really a proof and it's not a counterproof. All right. Have a wonderful day. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.